Welcome back today. We are still in the book of John, and we are looking at questions that Jesus asked us instead of us asking questions of him. And so if you have a Bible with you or somewhere handy and you would like to follow along, I'm going to be reading out of John chapter 9. It's a familiar story to us, and I think you will remember it pretty well. John chapter 9. It said, and as Jesus went along, he saw a man who was blind from birth. Now if you'll drop down to verse 6. He spit on the ground, and he made some mud with his saliva, and he put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, and wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. And so the man went and washed, and he came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Well, some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes opened?" they asked. And he replied, "The man they call Jesus made some mud, put it on my eyes, and he told me to go to Siloam and wash. And so I went and washed, and now I can see." It's a great story, isn't it? At the beginning of chapter 8, there is a theme that begins. He says, Jesus says, "I am the light of the world. The one who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." And so in chapter 9, John continues that theme of light and of life. He introduces us to a man who is blind. He's sitting beside the road, holding that little tin cup, begging from the people who are going by, trying to get enough money or enough that he can sustain himself for that day. We know he has been blind all of his life. Jesus spits into some clay, mixes it together, puts it on his eyes, and tells him to go wash. And when he comes back, he can see. The light of the world has certainly done the work that he was called to do. He has brought light to this man. The neighbors don't believe it. Is this not the man that used to sit and beg? And they weren't sure. And so they kind of broke into factions, and they began to argue. Because all people know that all people knew at that time that blind people, especially people who had been blind all of their lives, they don't get their sight back. And beggars are going to be beggars forever. So none of this fits into the pattern or their way of understanding the world. Yet this man insisted. He said, "The man that they call Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes, and he said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' And I went and I washed, and I received my sight." Well, the crowd wanted to be sure. And so they dragged him to the Pharisees, because surely these important officials will be able to settle this matter and get somewhere on with it. And it's kind of interesting. They almost made it sound like it was a crime. This man was blind, but now he can see. It's pretty rough, isn't it? I can almost imagine, although the Bible doesn't tell us this, I can imagine the Pharisees sort of wrinkling their brows and maybe pursing their lips as they are thinking about it, whispering among themselves, and then asking this man to repeat the story. And he did. They tried to act interested, but I believe that the thing that they only heard that day was that Jesus had healed and done this on the Sabbath day. And so they asked him again, and the man repeated those words over and over. Last Sabbath day, last Sabbath day. So they muddled together again in a conference, and they shook their heads, understanding and realizing they needed to get to the bottom of this. And so they called his parents. I can imagine what that was like. The mother wipes her eyes a little bit, her face. She pats her hair so that the hair on her head looks good. Maybe Dad left the animals and wondering what it is that the Pharisees are going to ask. Because these are simple people, poor people. And we're going to find out people who are scared. And they're dealing with people who are out of their circle. They don't normally rub shoulders with Pharisees. And so when the Pharisees ask this question, "Is this your son who you say was born blind? How is it that he now sees?" And I can almost picture them wringing their hands in fear and finally coming up with something, saying, "Ask him. He's of age. He will speak for himself." So the Pharisees met with the man for a second time. And they said, "Tell us again. Maybe they thought they missed something. Maybe there would be something else in his testimony that he had forgot to bring up before. Wasn't Jesus a fraud? Wasn't he a hoax? Wasn't he a fake? Well, the man held his ground. And he said, if this man was not from God, he could do nothing. Well, this was more than they could take. And so they threw him out. And it seems like this guy, as a result of this healing, which you think would be a good thing, and it is a good thing, but he's lost a lot. He's lost his vocation as a beggar. He doesn't know what else to do. He's not trained. His parents have been intimidated. His neighbors are confused and arguing. The leaders are enraged with him. And so John says in verse 35 that when Jesus heard that they had cast him out, he went and found him. Now, there are three, probably a lot more truths than that, but three truths that I want to point out for us today as we look at this. The first one is this: light comes to darkness. In the beginning of this story, Jesus came to the man in his blindness, in his darkness. 35 verses later, Jesus, the light, also comes again to the same man. The first, and so that says to me, we do not find him, but instead he finds us. Genesis starts off saying, in the beginning, God created the world. And it's very clear that God is the one who had taken the initiative for creating not only the world, but everything in it, including us. Even when people broke the trust of God, God was there with them in the garden. Light always comes to darkness. There's an old saying, and maybe you've heard it, that says, have you found God? And the response was, I didn't know he was lost. Well, you understand what we're saying. Jesus took this initiative. He hears that they have cast the man out, and so he goes and finds him. Light coming to darkness. William Temple said that three of the greatest words for a Christian is this, or in Christianity is this: Christ finds us. Christ finds us. Think about that. Light comes to darkness. There are things that we can't see. There are things that we don't know. Times we don't know where to go. Times maybe we feel trapped in our own spiritual lives or our own spiritual blindness, I guess I should say. And out of that, God begins to reveal himself to us. His light comes into our darkness, and he does for us what we can never do for ourselves. Helen Keller knew this truth. She was blind and deaf and mute. She was cut off from so much of the world, and it happened because when she was 18 months old, she had a terrible fever that took away her sight and her ability to speak and hear. Her parents really could do very little to help her, and the situations just seemed hopeless. The neighbors thought that she was mad or she had a severe mental disability. And then one day there was a woman by the name of Annie Sullivan from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, who became her teacher. A lot of people said that she was crazy, and maybe she was a little bit for doing this because this was an insurmountable task. But she stayed with it. And then one day there was a connection. She could feel the letters spelled out in her hand. She could make a connection from what those letters were, or the feeling in the palm of her hand, to whatever it was around her. And then it began. Helen went on to become a world citizen and one of great distinction. And one day, late in her life, this is what she wrote. To this day, I cannot command the uses of my soul or stir my mind to action without the memory of a quasi-electric touch of a teacher's fingers upon my palm. You see, Annie Sullivan opened the door for Helen that would never shut again. Helen would never say, I found it. Instead, what she would say was, I was found. That's what light does. So Jesus continues to come to us just like he did the blind man. The light shines in the darkness, John says in chapter 1, verse 5. Light comes to the darkness. Well, there's another truth in here I want to talk about. After the healing of this man and after all the harassment and the things that he went through, he met Jesus again, and Jesus asked him, "And do you believe in the Son of Man?" We've been talking about questions that Jesus asked, so this is the question we come to today. Do you believe in the Son of Man? This is really a discipleship question, the way John has phrased it and the way he puts it. In other words, he's saying, the light of the world has come. Will you accept it? Will you, that's what Jesus is saying to this man. The light has come. Will you accept it? Do you want to live in light or do you want to live in darkness? Do you believe in the Son of Man? John loved to take this phrase or this word believe and use it whenever he was speaking about Jesus. But the way John uses it throughout his book, it's not this mental kind of assent or exercise where I will believe in something in my head. Instead, it's more than that. In essence, he was saying, do you trust me? Will you follow me? Do you love me? And these are more than conversion questions. These are discipleship questions. Because discipleship always goes much beyond the head. It takes in our heart as well. You see, light cannot scatter the darkness that is in our lives until, first of all, it begins to penetrate every part of who we are. Matthew 23:37 says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your soul, with all your heart, with all of your mind. It is our whole being that is wrapped up, that is moving toward this light. We can refuse the light as Helen Keller could have refused the help of her teacher. She could have stayed in a stubborn, she could have stayed afraid, but instead she made a better choice. She gave herself up to the light that came, and it altered her life and more than she could ever begin to imagine. Well, our blind man in this story, he had to decide if he wanted to give himself up to the light or remain in darkness. It's the same question for us today. There's another truth in this story, and that is that darkness can turn to light. It says at the end of the story, he fell down and he worshiped Jesus. I'm sure this was not an easy decision for him. Light came for him very gradually, though. Early in chapter 9, the disciples called Jesus a rabbi. Well, when the man who is healed encounters Jesus, the first thing he does is he calls him a man. About 5 verses later, he calls him a prophet. Then when we come to the end of the chapter, he calls him Lord. Lord, I believe. And there he worshiped Jesus. Darkness turned to light. It happened slowly, but it happened surely. And so that image of darkness turning to light became a symbol of conversion for the early church. In fact, in the 2nd century, when Christians would hide in the catacombs, they would etch on the walls things about their belief. And so some of the early frescoes that were there about baptism included this story of the healing of the blind man. Now, I sometimes think that we often see this story through that single lens, that Jesus shines his light into our darkness, and we accept him as Lord and Savior of our lives, and our lives are no longer in darkness. We are living in light. We are not blind. That's what he says. Do you believe the Son of Man? Do you trust me? Do you follow me? I don't believe this is a one-time question that we answer and then coast for the rest of our lives, doing whatever we want or believing however we want to believe or acting upon whatever we want to act on. I don't believe it happens like that. I believe this is a daily question. Do you trust me? Will you follow me? This is a question of discipleship. This is a question for us as followers. For you see, the points that are hidden in the story are also points for us. That there is light that comes into the darkness, into our darkness. I'm in darkness. I am blind in many ways. I don't always see the struggles of people around me, especially people who are different from me or who have different experiences from me. And so sometimes it's hard for me to see the plight of the poor and understand what it's like to live in their world and in their lives. Or for someone who's a female, it's hard for me to understand that fully. For someone who's of a different race, that's why I think this whole discussion or conversation that unfortunately has taken a violent turn is an important one for us, because I want light to come to my darkness in order to help me to see some things that I haven't seen. And the question is, the second point in this is, Will you and I, as followers of Jesus Christ, will we accept the light when it comes? When I was in Ireland a few years ago, I went on a falcon walk, which meant that the trainer had a falcon on his arm, and it would fly and come back, and it would land on our arms. It was a kind of exciting time. We learned a lot, and one of the things that we learned was about this phrase called hoodwinked. And I've heard that all my life. Someone's hoodwinked. They've been tricked. That's what I thought it meant. But this origin comes from people who would put hoods on falcons and on other birds, especially when they were around people and they were in training, because it would keep their eyes closed to certain things so that they wouldn't get afraid, and they would also begin to focus on the prey and hunting. So that idea of putting a hood over their eyes and winking, closing their eyes, meant that idea of having a closed eyes. I sometimes think we walk around with hoods, seeing only the things that we have been told to see and believing only the things that we've been told to believe. I heard a podcast several months ago. There was a Jewish woman and a rabbi and a Christian pastor who were having a discussion about family life, and they were talking about the different ways that it is approached. And the woman said, in the Jewish tradition of studying the Bible, we always start with the Bible, and then we look at reason, then we look at experiences, we look at things that are around us, we ask questions. And Christians use the Bible to close the conversation. I tell you, that hit me really hard, because I thought that really is true. We don't use the Bible to say, let's begin to find an answer to this. Instead, whenever there's a discussion going on, we'll say, well, this is what the Bible says, and then we'll slam the Bible shut, and we will end that conversation. Do we allow the light to shine? Darkness can also turn to light. Thank God I'm not the same person I used to be, and I'm not the same person that I will be in the future. Someone said that the very heart of discipleship is to have your eyes opened. That takes a long time. And I can bear witness that through the experiences I've had and the opportunities I have had, God has opened and continues to open my eyes to things that I don't see. I do see things now that I didn't see, or I hear things that I didn't hear. I interpret Scripture or events differently than I did before. I don't hold tightly to things that I used to hold tightly to. I hold them a little bit more looser now. That light that came into my darkness has changed that darkness back to light. As we leave, I just want to leave a couple of questions. What is it that keeps you blind? And do you want your eyes opened? Not everybody does. Do you trust Him enough that He's going to take you on a journey where you will see things that you have never seen before, and hear things you've never heard before, and experience things you've never experienced before, and that it's going to be good? I want to close with this prayer. God, may your light so fill up our lives until all of the rooms know healing and the places of our heart are touched with your brightness. So may that be our prayer for this week. And I'm glad you were here, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great day.